We are discussing Neha's new book, The Power Pause: How to Plan a Career Break After Kids and Come Back Stronger Than Ever. This book is a first of its kind guide for women who are on career pauses, who are working part-time, or are considering a more flexible career for a season. Welcome, Neha.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So you start the book by defining the power pause. So let's start there. What does the power pause mean?
The power pause was the language I needed for making room for family life by maybe pausing your career or downshifting your career and recognizing that you are still growing. You're discovering a more expansive identity. You're exploring new hobbies and interests. And really, the idea is that you are still growing alongside your kids.
And this is something that Amy and I have experienced. My own mother had a career and found it very challenging in the 60s when this was not really being discussed at all. The idea that there were kind of two paths. You were a working person or a mother, and that those were two entirely separate identities. And that I know my mom talked about having, people would reach out to her and be like, oh, I really admire that you chose not to have kids, because she was still working in her 30s. And it does feel like in our generation, and hopefully for the generation after ours, these are becoming more integrated identities, but we're not there yet, right? Somehow.
I think we're getting there. And I think, the goal of this book is really to add another option on the table, because I think that's what we're all seeking, is more options to make it work and to play in the long game of work and family. And you're right. I think we were looking at much more black and white, antiquated notions of stay-at-home or working. And the reality is, as you both can speak to, is so many more of us exist in between. And we're, the goal of this book is that we can ultimately be able to dial up or dial down or exist in between with more support, less shame, and, dare I say, a little bit more joy.
And we had Gabrielle Blair on a few weeks ago talking about her book, The Kids Are All Right. And sort of the central point of that book is when we were thinking about our kids becoming independent adults of their own, we can feel very stressed when they seem to be straying from the one clear path. But her whole point of the book is there is no one clear path. Maybe we don't go to college. Maybe the job you thought you'd have was an AI job. Maybe you can work from home. That these strict boxes we think our kids need to fit into don't exist anymore anyway. And so is the power pause about reframing that for yourself, that the possibilities are endless instead of I have to do exactly what I did before, even if it doesn't work for me anymore?
I think we're all sort of re-examining the ideas of boxes, right? Like, our culture has loved putting people in boxes. That's how we make sense of the world. And I think for a really long time, especially in this last couple decades, we've attached a lot of our self-worth and identity to the box of what do we do, right? And when we part with that as ambitious women, when we say, I'm going to step off this one clear path, it does bring up this identity crisis of, well, then who am I if I'm not a brand marketer for so-and-so organization, right? Like, I lost that very pithy way of answering what you do and had to face, well, the alternative was stay-at-home mother, and that didn't quite fit either, right? And so the goal is really to give women the sense of, right now, we may be pausing our paid work for family life and shifting our priorities, and we're leaving room to grow personally or hold even professional or creative pursuits alongside family life. And we're sort of blurring those really black and white edges of that box, that we can step into a chapter like this with more of an open sense of, how can I grow? And speaking about what your conversation was with Gabrielle, a lot of that conversation was, how do we also separate our success from our children? And that's one of those traps that I think when I paused my own paid work to step into stay-at-home motherhood, even if that title didn't quite fit, I fell into sort of that trope of, well, now if I'm not getting promoted and I'm not getting a salary, my new success is how my kids are acting. And we all know that is like a path to failure for your relationship with the kids, and also the first tantrum your child has, but also the first time my child pushed another child, I was like, I'm raising a sociopath. I'm now a failure. And the reality was, like, I'm neither a sociopath and I'm not a failure, but I had to quickly figure out, like, this is not, I chose this chapter and I had the privilege to choose because I wanted more time with him. But I also want goals of my own, right? And I think that chapter in the book about rewriting your own success metrics is probably the singular most important chapter in the whole thing.
And you talk about another term as we start to define terms. You spend some time on this term, stay-at-home mom, because it has, I think, negative connotations maybe still for us in our society. My Aunt Terry Hecker wrote a book called Ever Since Adam and Eve about being a stay-at-home mom and that kind of disappearing identity that comes along with that people would kind of back away from her at cocktail parties. Like, I don't have anything to say to the stay-at-home mom.
Totally.
That sounds like diapers and cooking to me. And I don't want to talk about that because I'm here to network with people. So talk a little bit about how you talk in the book about this identity of stay-at-home mom.
Your aunt's experience is so many people's experience, and that was a big reason I started the platform. Because when I started I had my first son in 2016, and it was the height of the lean in movement and the girl boss era. And, I think it was sort of this precipice. It's like this peak of that second wave feminism where we had done incredible work to propel women forward in showing our capacity in the workforce. But what we did was we left behind anyone making room for family life in the 1970s with this caricature of what a stay-at-home mother is. To this day, if you we ran a survey across the country, 1,200 at-home parents, but 1,000 members of the general population. If you ask people what they think of with a stay-at-home mother, they'll say June Cleaver. If you ask them what the working mother looks like, they'll say Michelle Obama. One is fact and modern, and one is total fiction. And, the reality of that caricature of the 1970s is that we've come such a long way since then, right? We have women having children, at the average age of 30. And so they've clocked in more work experience. They have more equitable relationships with their partners, right? The dads in two-parent households are spending 3 times the amount of time with their kids. They have access to tools and technology, whether they're creating or podcasting or writing or taking online classes in accounting, right? Like, they are finding ways to grow and stay connected. And so this whole static image that we'd stuck with just didn't fit. And then by sheer nature of the linguistics of stay-at-home mother, stay at home implies shut in, stuck in one place. And working is like an active verb. So by nature of that, we're saying, like, you over there are just in one place. And we sort of associated her with like pleasant homemaking. And so women are just getting counted out as soon as they step into those career breaks or chapters. Yeah, motherhood.
Also, the word stay is permanent. The stay-at-home mom, it's not
correct. It's permanent and finite.
Right now at home mom, it's permanent, it's finite. And, speaking for my mom, who was a stay-at-home mom and darn good at it, I think women like her, and there are women today, the whole trad wife thing, it's like, don't tell me that this isn't honorable and wonderful. And yes, it is. And it is. But I think they feel like the backlash is coming from working women as opposed from society, right? And we end up being pitted against each other. So is this book, if there's a woman who is a stay-at-home mom and intends to be one for the foreseeable future, is keeping her options open, is there still, will she still find herself in this book, The Power Pause? How would she approach this idea?
Well, the book really follows the arc of preparing. So, it really tackles some of the themes around identity, which I think applies to everyone making sense of their ambition and feminism and how they're making choices, whatever those may be in their work and family. It tackles finances. And I think that's really important in terms of being able to walk through this stage, feeling like whether you're going to be at home forever or at home for a season, to be able to know that you're contributing and to be able to have those dignified conversations with your partner, I think that is like the bedrock of being able to walk through the stage with your head held high. And then, the middle section really is about how do I set up this stage of life with intention? So I'm not just floating through it, but I am recognizing myself as a separate individual who, the way we dignify our time is with goals, and to be able to set authentic goals, whether they be personal, whether they be professional, whether they be family oriented. I think that sort of prescriptive guide to be able to do that so that this stage in life can feel like yours too. I think that piece sort of is universal, but followed with how do I then set up a day to day with my kids so that they feel oriented towards those goals and so that I'm thriving alongside them? How do I get scripts and solutions for getting help? And then, that last section, which I think you're speaking about, really is about the possibility, right? It's about how do I use this stage to connect with other parents and women and professionals so that I am expanding my network? How do I use this time to discover more about myself in terms of hobbies? And then, the last section really is about how do I put it all together and tell this story so that I have more options available to me if and when I return. And whether or not you are returning to the paid workforce, you are still doing work of value. You are still growing. And, the book really is intended to give you a guide to be able to do all of that work with confidence and a little bit more ease.
And I think just based on the conversation we've already had, it's really interesting to me, the dynamic of we're talking about change and our mothers and how it's changed. And I feel like the dialogue that we're in right now, that intentionality of the work kind of disappears when we're pitted between whoever the punter or kicker was who gave the speech about women's highest calling is to be home.
Harrison Bucker.
There you go. Or the kind of trad wife, I'm in my beautiful dress stirring and raising oxtails or something in my kitchen. That seems, like Amy was saying, we're kind of the working women reject that because we're so much different than that. But the book does kind of bring the identity of strength and intelligence and purposefulness into the space of staying at home, that they don't have to be you're either kind of mindlessly stirring batter while looking beautiful, or you're giving a PowerPoint in the front office, and that those two things are diametrically opposed somehow.
Correct. And I think that other piece, which is so important, that has been what the, quote unquote, mommy wars have relied on, is this idea that one is better than the other.
Right.
And what we know in all the research is that whether you work out of the home or in the home or exist in between, the kids are all right as long as they have one secure caregiver, that they understand that they are safe and loved. And by the way, we had tremendous research in the book, especially around the section around permitting yourself to get help as a home parent, that actually having other responsible caregivers helps a child's security. So, I think this, if we can sort of set aside that people are making a choice because it's better for the kids, then we can own the choices for what they are, which is the choices we're each individually making that works for our families and that we're always shifting. And I think that was what was so damaging about Harrison Butker's content. The trad wife content we can also, dive into, but it's this idea that we are stuck in one decision forever. That is our one role, when what we know is we are always evolving. We're always shifting. The data shows us that 1 in 3 women working out of the home right now are planning a pause in the next 2 years. 1 in 2 are planning to downshift their hours in their next 2 years. 90% of the women who are on pause aim to return to the workforce, right? So we're all shifting to make room for family life. And we see it with this boom of freelance and entrepreneurship, right? There's just so many more of us just trying to figure out a way to work on things we care about, family included, do good, make money. And I think, we all have more in common. We're more alike than we're different, really. And so stepping into that just helps us come together, which is what we need now more than ever. More options and more togetherness.
Totally. We're going to take a break and we're going to talk about a foundational issue around the power pause, which is finances. We are talking to Neha Ruche And she is the author of The Power Pause: How to Plan a Career Break After Kids and Come Back Stronger Than Ever. We'll be right back. So you spend a lot of time in this book talking about finances, how finances affect this choice, and how to make a plan around finances. This is something we talk about a lot on the podcast in terms of the conversations sometimes we don't have. Like, well, I just want to be home, or I'm tired of my job, or I feel I should do this. But this is foundationally a decision that is very rooted in finances. So take us through your approach and how you start to talk about the connection between home finances and the power bus.
Well, I lead the book with identity, and right after that, it's finances,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
Because I can't sugarcoat the reality that it comes with financial risk. There is some degree of financial risk, but you can mitigate that risk. And before you even think about the risk, I think you can mitigate the idea of losing your financial independence, which I think is the part, no matter whether this choice is a privilege or it's something you have to do, which, by the way, 1 in 3 women feel like they're forced to take a career break because of the cost of childcare right now. 60% of women are taking career pauses because of financial considerations. So I want to toss out the idea that stay-at-home motherhood is a luxury. I think once upon a time, we did associate it with luxury. And when we associate one side with luxury, we assume like that doesn't deserve support. And then it gets counted out of the dialogue, right? And I think it's not to say working out of the home is a luxury. It's to say that the privilege is to get to choose. So then once we sort of move past that, I think this idea that we all universally contend with is if we have clocked in a decade in our career, we have experienced financial independence and financial worth. And then, having been raised in the feminist movement, it is very hard to disassociate with bringing in the power that is equated to money. And so it takes some real dialogue with, in the case of a two-partner household, to decide, why is one of the partners making this choice? How does it benefit the whole system? And I think in having that conversation, I would like to say 3 to 6 months ahead of time, then the two parents in the household are saying, we together are making this choice for one partner to pause because they are now going to be able to take on more of the emotional labor, the family administration, and the partner working out of the home is now going to be equally dependent on the partner working in the home to provide all that care because it allows them to be able to single task outside of the home. And the reason why that mindset is so critical is because then as you move forward and you're budgeting year over year, you are both making lifestyle adjustments to accommodate the shift in household income, right? And I have heard one too many stories of the woman who's giving herself haircuts because she's like, well, I can no longer spend money because I've forfeited my income to be at home.
I can't.
No, you
should
should.
buy things.
Correct. And now the reality is, no, your household organization decided for one partner to do more of that work in the home. And you are allowed to invest it out of the joint household income just as freely as the other. And you together are making those budgeting sacrifices. Now, it also speaks to the budgeting investment around help, right? Because if you are considering yourself sort of the piggy bank of the household now by like saving on childcare, then when you need or want to decide to bring on a mother's helper for 10 hours a week, or you're going to start outsourcing laundry to make a little bit more room for yourself to be healthy and whole, that investment has to come out of the whole household, right? And so the mindset of a joint household income has to sort of be established before that pause. And I do sort of spell out the reality about the conversations to be had or the steps needed if you are feeling like there's any orange or red flags that is not going to be a mindset that is adopted in your household, right? Because if there is a world that your marriage is feeling rocky, this might not be the time to part with your income. It might be the time to downshift or look for flexible options if you need more room for family life but can't disconnect. And so we sort of spell out those conversations and options in that
So you
chapter.
Can we talk about how you also talk about the intentionality that you set at work when you're going into this pause? if it's a job that you think you would like or might like, or there's a world in which you might like to return to, how do you be intentional with that on the way out so they don't just pat you on the head and assume they'll never see you again?
Hmm. And I think that applies whether or not you think you're going to return,
Yeah,
Right.
it does.
because you have worked, let's use my phone, right? If you worked 10 years, right? And you have established an incredible roster of accomplishments and connections, and to dignify that, you want to, even if you're like not 100% happy on the way out, you want to be able to nurture those connections to be able to carry them into this next stage of life, right? And so I talk a lot about sort of networking on the way out, and how you might seek out the mentor, seek out the allies. And that can be, by the way, the assistant to the CEO, and it can be the CEO. Whoever you feel you've built a nice relationship with, take them to those coffees, take them to those lunches, write a note, and talk about, stepping into the sabbatical for family life. Be very clear and deliberate about making this choice. But you might even ask, like, please keep me in mind should any opportunities come up. I'd love to stay connected to this work. It's meant so much to me. By being able to sort of exit gracefully, you're keeping those relationships intact as, one way to preserve your options on the other side. And, we talk a little bit about also owning that change on your LinkedIn. So many women, as soon as they part with their work, they sort of shut down that sort of profile because they don't know how to express themselves there. And I'm not saying like make a big, bold announcement about having stepped into this career pause for family life. I did interview someone who did do that, and I think it really served her incredibly well. But I am talking about taking the care, and and sort of lay out the options to do this, but take the care to address those years of experience and close that chapter at whatever organization you are with your head held high about what you accomplished, so that as you're parting, you're making sure to acknowledge that those skills, that network, do not evaporate once you step into a career break. And I think, especially from an identity grief perspective, so many women mourn that sort of working sense of self, but you are still a working parent. You are still a professional. You may be shifting priorities for a chapter, but everything you accomplish goes with you. And when and if you transition back to the paid workforce, even if, like so many women do, to a different skill set, it'll be important to have those relationships as well as that story feeling available to you.
I just had a neighbor who posted they were doing layoffs at my job, and I'm taking this opportunity, and I'm so thrilled to be leaving because this is a time I really want to focus on what's going on in town and what's going on with my kids. And I really admired it. I think for a lot of women, it can feel like, oh, I'm out, I guess. This is here. They punched my ticket, and I guess I'm just a stay-at-home mom now. And it really struck me, this idea of saying, I'm choosing this now for a while and making it powerful statement as opposed to sort of like slinking off into suburban. I find this for myself. Sometimes I run into friends in the city and well, I'm out in the suburbs driving a minivan, and it
Yeah.
feels almost shameful to be home with our kids after having been working people. And it really struck me, and I had just read the book, this resonance of taking the power in saying, this is what I'm doing for now. And when you make it public, you never know who's saying, we need somebody to consult with this thing that's going on that might be paid or part-time, and owning that pause. And there's so much of that power in this book.
Mhm. Well, what I love hearing is a couple things. She got laid off, and we speak a little bit about this in chapter 3, this idea that oftentimes when you get laid off, you didn't have the privilege
Right.
of a 3 to 6 month planning and that power of making that choice. It can feel like, oh, the choice was made for me. And you get to take the agency back when you choose it for yourself, when you take sort of whatever package you were given, whether it was 2 weeks or whether it was 3 months, and you use that to intentionally think, am I going to, start a job search, or am I going to start to think about how I can use this next few months or next year for my family life? And then what else she said in that statement was, I'm going to use this to dive into my community. She talked about spending time with her kids, but she also opened herself to the possibility of figuring out new ways to express her ambition and her interests and her identity. And I think that that part of it, being open to the other ways to stay engaged, what she's doing there is she's reshaping everyone's perception of time at home, because it's not just in the home, right? It's volunteering, it's taking classes, it's reconnecting to her old network, it's exploring old hobbies and passions, it's getting involved with nonprofits. There's so much that happens in the fringe hours of family life. And I love that she took that back for herself.
Neha, I wanted to revisit something you said in the first segment, which was that goals are how we dignify our time. I'd never heard that before. I love that. It seems to me that's sort of what you're saying with this. So if you are in the pause, you're listening to this, and you're feeling a little stuck, a little concerned about the on-ramp that's to come, how do you set goals that dignify your time?
I think it can be really hard when you first step into pause. Oftentimes a pause or downshift is at a time of transition. So it's normal to be like, oh, I got to get my sea legs. Like I'm transitioning to 2 kids, or my child is a teenager and we are just in it with, mental health issues that we're navigating. But when you sort of come up for air and you feel that nudge of, oh, I'm floating a little bit, and I feel like my time is just passing me by, that's a good moment to really take some time to figure out, well, if this chapter is still a chapter of my life too, it's not just about the kids, how do I want it to serve me? And people might say, well, I don't know what I want to go back to yet. And it's not about going back. It's about moving in the direction that you're growing intentionally, right? And so I talk in the book about a few ways to do this, but my favorite one that I've shared now is write your ideal day in 3 years, like down to what you're wearing, how you're feeling in your body, who you're spending time with, what your day's structured like, what you're spending time on in terms of projects. And oftentimes it will reveal to you just little interests, or it might, if you're talking about how strong you feel or silly you feel with your kids, and that dynamic, it might mean, well, I want to feel sillier in my family life, which was one of my, that was really a goal. And then the metric under that was, I'm going to have a dance party every Monday. That's how I'm going to start my week. And it's small and it's measurable. And at the end of the year, I feel like I move forward toward this thing I really want. And then creatively or professionally, it was, I've always loved content. I now have this stage of life where I can be a little bit more free to dabble. I'm going to start writing again. And, in the beginning when I was, with 2 kids under the age of 3, it was, I'm going to write 3 blog posts a week. That was it. And, on a personal level, it was, I want to feel less reactive. Reactivity had been a thing. You and I, we were speaking about this before, about your episode with Mina Dubin. Reactivity is a thing that is really challenging for me. And, that doesn't get pushed quite like a toddler can push it. And so that was a real deep personal goal that I wanted to use this chapter of my life to work on. And so for a while, it was like, listen to a podcast every week. Then it became, okay, start a meditation practice 5 minutes every morning, right? And so there are these, these really authentic goals that aren't about promotions, and they aren't about, salary raises, but they are deeply authentic to and aligned with how I envision a successful day in a few years. And I think, for women, that can be a really perspective expanding exercise that when and if they do return to the workforce, they're bringing all of that incredible experience with them.
We're talking to Neha Ruche. She is the author of the new book, The Power Pause, and we'll be right back.
So when you talk about changing perspectives, this is fundamental to the book. You start each chapter with an actual perception definition and then a change of that perception. And I'm going to read one of them. Talking about resume gaps. Primary parenthood is not a resume gap. It's a chapter in which I shifted my priorities to grow and learn in new ways. And I think fundamental to all of these perception changes is this issue we've been talking about, that this work doesn't really matter. It's not really real. It's just staying at home. And what I love about this book is that you bring the kind of approaches that we take about things we take seriously, like, for example, our careers, and you bring those things into the home. And that I think sometimes we skip that because we don't feel like putting on a dance party every Monday is a valuable enough pursuit to take the time to plan.
And we not only diminish that work, but we also have trivialized motherhood to diapers and laundry.
Right. And
When
anyone can do that. So you'll just be another person who steps into diapers and laundry, which everybody does.
And it can so easily be outsourced, right?
Right.
When really the real sort of awe-inspiring work of motherhood is the woman in St. Louis I spoke to whose daughter has diabetes and, was noticing differences in her behavior and took her to a series of specialists to get that diagnosed. And now it is educating other new parents of children with diabetes and has become a mentor to other parents with newly diagnosed children. And she's writing guides for the school nurse every single school year, right? And, that kind of work is the work that is sort of just, it's so nuanced that we haven't sort of put it together, and it's not photogenic, right? So we don't see that on Instagram, but that is the real sort of behind the scenes intellectual and emotional labor that is going into raising this generation. And it is highly specific to the family and the child. And, when we realize how much of that is happening, then we realize, well, we are running really complicated household organizations, and no wonder parents need or want to shift to make room for that, because that can't be easily outsourced in all the cases. And so, when we stop seeing it as this sort of playful, easy minutia, and we really sort of elevate and dignify it as the work of running a family organization during interesting transitions and childhood development phases, then we can start to have complicated conversations about how do we figure out, what we can let go of to make these day-to-days simpler and easier on the parent. How can we think about the right sort of creative childcare solutions so these parents can get the support that they do deserve? Because too many parents feel like, oh, well, this is so easy and, anyone can do it. I should do this 24/7, when no one else works 24/7 without breaks. Right. And so I think that has been a lot of the challenge our culture. We're finally getting to a place of, talking about the unpaid value the value of unpaid labor. But we are sort of trying to still doing the work of dignifying that as real intellectual and emotional and respected labor.
That's really useful because I've seen a million times in my 2 decades as a parent, the whole, like, if you paid a stay-at-home parent for her job, chauffeur, $50,000 a year, that whole meme that you would be paid $10 million a year.
$184,000 a year.
Yeah. But it is still like laundry folder, chauffeur. It isn't IEP rater, medical researcher,
medical mystery solver.
Yes,
correct.
Yes, the things that all of us do that are just as much a part of the job, and might lead to paths of new meaningful work. I know somebody who started a migraine research foundation because she had a child with chronic migraine. It's like changing the course of research. Not all of us have that thing fall into our laps or have the financial independence to create our own new job. But when you can make it happen, it's pretty exciting.
Well, 70% of women who have taken a career pause will say it has changed their perspective, right, on work, regardless of socioeconomic means. And I think exactly what you're speaking of, we're all coming up on the different problems and challenges and joys our family encounters, right? And oftentimes, I think the boom of women and mothers, specifically in entrepreneurship, is one part because women are trying to figure out how to make work for them. And it's another part because we are constantly solving problems in our family life. And then we're like, oh, how can we solve for or advocate or help other people solving that problem? And so I think that there's a really interesting um, path to those passions and interests in this stage of life. I see it over and over, but I also see it in a really like fun and uplifting way. Was in Philadelphia speaking to a group of women last week, and there was a woman who introduced herself as a retired lawyer. She clocked in 12 years in law before having her first child. She has a toddler now, and she's discovering storytelling again through her child's eyes. And she'd always actually wanted to be a bookseller. She'd always wanted to have a bookstore. She can't go and open a bookstore yet, but she's volunteering her time to help bookstores, independent bookstores, gain their footing in like obviously an interesting economy. And so, you start to see how parents can use this stage of life to actually expand their connections outside of the ones that they'd sort of had by the water cooler. And now it's happening in, baby groups, or it might be happening on playgrounds or PTA or at the drop-off line. And then they're actually allowing themselves to discover new interests through the way that they're spending their time. And that's where the real power happens, even if they don't ultimately go to that, right? Like I will interviewed this woman, Chanu Richardson, also a lawyer, had been at sort of a top 5 firm, moved from London to San Francisco, had her 2 kids, and actually did dabble in content creation, podcasting, actually. And then realized, it wasn't really going to be for her, but she was so glad that she could express her creativity, build new connections that way. She actually ended up going back to a large entertainment firm as an in-house counsel 4 years after. And, the dots always connect backward. But when we talk about portfolios of work experience, it's not just the traditional work experience, right? Like we talked a little bit in the last segment about respecting all of the work accomplishments you had prior to children. And then you're adding on top of that all the non-traditional connections and advocacy and volunteering. And then you're sort of figuring out, well, what's that going to lead me to next?
And I read this book last week to prepare, and I find myself having conversations with my kids and the visibility of who we are in our own work and trying to put that in front of my kids. And I have a son who was just working on an essay, this historical essay, and you need to find 3 proofs and examples. And he said, well, do you have to do any of this at your job? Like, you don't have to write historical essays. I said, I am constantly putting together documents and pitches and reaching out to people and trying to explain who I am and what I do. And it is exactly the same as a historical essay in that I introduce what I'm trying to say, and then I find 3 pieces of proof. And I think that giving voice, and even as we make financial decisions, if I'm not working and dad might be working, this is what's happening this year. Next year might be a little thin because I'm going to go out on a limb and try to make something happen. And I think that that's something that I've become much more aware of, is saying, I used to do this for a living. I've changed jobs, but back then, and that's why I'm really good at helping you read this play and break down what it's about, because I did that for years as a writer and actor. And that I found it very useful in reading this book to revisit the idea of like power in all things. It's not just, as Amy was asking, it's not just the pause because you're getting ready to go back and you have to keep one eye on this. It's the power of saying like, this was part of my life, and that's why I have this aptitude in this other area. And I found that so useful.
Well, and I love that you're changing the way in which we're speaking to our children. I found myself recently talking a lot about right now. Obviously, as I get ready to put this book out into the world, we're looking at a different work schedule, and I'm traveling more, and I'm not home until 5 o'clock. And that's new. That has been new for my kids since this past school year. And we sat down at the beginning of last fall and had a dialogue about how, the goals of this year look a little bit different, how dad's going to be doing more of the pickups right now, and how we're going to get to reevaluate in the spring. And I think being able to talk about the fluidity of it has been really interesting for them to know that there are seasons that you're sprinting, there are seasons that you're sort of able to control your schedule more, and then there are sort of seasons of rest. And I think this generation will grow up with a more fluid narrative about work and family. I talk a lot about how, if this work is a success, that my daughter will never really understand the phrase stay-at-home or working mother, right? She'll know she had a mother who was present, who worked on many things she cared about and loved her very much. And I think that what a more freeing world that would be.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about Mother Untitled.
So I started it back in 2017. It was, like I said, the height of the lean-in movement, and I wanted a platform, a community, a resource for women like myself who are ambitious, are modern, and are finding ways to grow in career pauses, finding ways to work on new pursuits alongside family life. And I wanted to update the perception of the stay-at-home mother so women could connect and know they're part of a really interesting cohort who are doing some deep thinking and meaningful work, and for women to have resources like coaches or financial planners. There's a flex jobs board on there so that they have access to fractional or flexible freelance opportunities so that they can stay connected to income if they need or want to. And really, the concept of Untitled, it really spoke to getting away from those black and white titles as stay-at-home and working mother, and also recognizing our power and identity even without a fancy work title.
And tell our audience where they can find more of your work. And I mean, they know probably how to buy a book, but where should they find more of your work and the book?
So you can follow along with me on Mother Untitled on Instagram. That's where I share a lot of the reframes we were talking about, Margaret, on the site, motheruntitled.com. There's tremendous free resources, and the newsletter we're dropping every Sunday. And of course, yes, we would love you to purchase the book. It really is a vote for the movement, and it's a great investment in this stage of life.
Neha Ruche's new book is The Power Pause: How to Plan a Career Break After Kids and Come Back Stronger Than Ever. We will link to it and everything Neha has talked about today in the show notes. Neha, thanks for talking to us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.